What would you do if hunger pushed you so far that the unthinkable became your only choice? Imagine a mother, barefoot and hollow-eyed, clutching her baby in the dust of a country road. She whispers a plea no heart should ever hear, "Take my baby. Give me bread." And in that silence, a rancher stands frozen, torn between judgment and compassion. He says nothing, and then, he does something no one expected. This story will grip you, break you, and rebuild you, because it isn't just about hunger. It's about mercy, sacrifice, and the power of love when everything else is gone. The sun leaned heavy over the prairie, its heat pressing down on the earth until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Dust rose with every step, clinging to sweat-damp skin and cracked lips. Clara walked as though her legs no longer belonged to her body, moving forward only because stopping would mean death. Her bare feet were torn and raw, each step sinking into the dry road that stretched endlessly in front of her. In her arms, her baby whimpered with a frailty that chilled her more than the hunger in her belly. She tightened her hold, whispering softly to him though her voice was little more than air scraped through a parched throat. "Just a little further, Samuel. Just hold on for Mama." His tiny hand curled against her chest, his cry thinning into silence, and that silence frightened her most of all. Clara's mind carried her backward as much as her body staggered forward. She had once lived in a village alive with laughter, where the scent of bread baking and the murmur of neighbors filled the mornings. That village had been swallowed by the drought. First, the crops shriveled, stalks turning brittle and useless. Then the animals began to die, one by one, until the barnyards were quiet graves. The river they had depended on shrank into a winding scar of dust, and soon even the strongest men could no longer bring food home. Some left to chase rumors of work to the west. Others simply disappeared. Clara had been left with her son, and with nothing else. She had prayed, pleaded, even begged on her knees at doors that would not open. In the end, there had been no more doors to knock on, no more neighbors to hear. The ranch rose before her like a mirage. Fences stretched across the horizon, tall and straight, enclosing wide pastures where cattle grazed lazily despite the dry season. Horses stood near the shade of a wooden barn, tails swishing flies. The house, with its weathered boards and smoke rising faintly from the chimney, looked to Clara like a fortress of plenty. She clutched Samuel tighter, her steps faltering but pulled forward by desperation. She reached the gate, where a man stood tall against the glare of the sun, his hands resting on the wood as though he had been waiting for something, or someone. He was broad-shouldered, his shirt worn soft with years of work, his face shadowed by a wide hat. His eyes were steady, dark, unreadable, like the deep waters of a well that might never give up its secrets. Clara's breath hitched in her chest. Fear tangled with desperation, but hunger pushed her past shame. She stumbled the last steps until she stood before him, her knees nearly buckling. Her voice broke as she tried to speak, and the words that left her mouth tasted like ash and salt. "Please, bread. I have nothing left. Take my baby. Just give me bread." The world hushed around her. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their endless cry. The man didn't move. His eyes flickered to the baby in her arms, to the thin face pressed against her shoulder, then back to her hollow eyes. The silence stretched, unbearable, and Clara's knees gave way. She sank to the ground, dust rising around her like a shroud, her hair falling into her face. Tears cut paths through the grime on her cheeks. She pressed Samuel into the dirt before her as if offering him like a sacrifice. Her voice fell to a broken whisper. "He deserves to live. I don't care if I die. Just let him live, please." The man crouched slowly, his large frame lowering until he was eye level with her. His shadow fell over her, his hands resting on his knees. The baby's weak whimper filled the silence, and his tiny hand stretched toward the stranger's rough, sunburned fingers. The man did not speak. He did not tell her no, did not tell her yes. His jaw tightened, and the silence seemed to thunder louder than any rejection. Clara trembled, convinced she had failed, that her plea had been too much, too terrible to bear. She buried her face in Samuel's thin blanket, sobbing into the fabric. And then the man moved. Without a word, he slid his arms beneath both mother and child and lifted them as though they weighed nothing. Clara gasped, startled, her cry choked with both terror and disbelief. She was too weak to resist, too shocked to speak. He carried her past the gate, the creak of wood behind them closing off the barren road she had traveled. She clung to her baby as the scent of hay and leather filled her nose, the sound of cattle lowing echoing across the yard. He carried her into the house, the door swinging wide on its hinges. Inside, the air was cool compared to the punishing sun outside, shadows wrapping around her like unfamiliar arms. He set her gently on a worn couch near the hearth, the cushions dipping beneath her frail weight. Samuel whimpered, his eyes fluttering closed in exhaustion. Clara looked up at the man, her breath ragged. Why both? The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it, born of confusion and fear. The man's voice was gravel, deep and raw from disuse. Because bread won't be enough. Her chest ached at his words. For the first time in days, Clara let her body fall back into the couch. Tears spilled freely, soaking into the fabric beneath her. The fire snapped softly in the hearth, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Samuel's breathing steadied as he drifted into the first true sleep he'd had since her milk had dried. Clara stroked his hair with shaking fingers, her heart breaking with relief and guilt. The man didn't ask her name. He didn't tell her his. He only sat on the other side of the room, staring into the flames, his silence heavy but strangely comforting. For hours, the only sounds were the crackle of wood, the soft sigh of wind outside, and the rhythmic breaths of a baby who, for tonight at least, would not go hungry. Clara watched him through her tears, uncertain if he was a savior or simply a man who could not turn away. But in the depths of his silence, she felt something unspoken, a promise that she was not alone anymore, at least not tonight. The days that followed passed like water dripping slowly into a dry cup, each drop a small miracle. Clara awoke in a bed softer than she remembered beds could be, her body sinking into the quilt as though it had been waiting to cradle her all along. Her feet, once raw and bleeding, were wrapped in clean cloth. Her lips, once cracked and bleeding, were moistened with broth the rancher set beside her without a word. Samuel slept beside her, his cheeks fuller already, the rise and fall of his chest steady in a way that made her close her eyes and whisper thanks into the silence. Every morning began the same, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen, the sound of boots moving across the wooden floor. She listened to those boots the way some people listen to hymns, their steady rhythm reminding her she was still alive, that Samuel was still alive. She tried not to trust it. Hope had been dangerous before, a cruel mirage that vanished when she reached for it. She watched the man, Daniel, she learned after overhearing someone call his name from the road, and wondered why he offered food and shelter without asking for anything in return. Men in her village had bartered cruelly with desperation, demanding more than a woman could give for less than she needed. Yet Daniel asked for nothing. He moved with quiet purpose, working from dawn until the stars returned, mending fences, feeding animals, checking water troughs. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his face unreadable, his silence louder than any words. Clara began to help in small ways, driven more by unease than gratitude. She gathered eggs from the coop, her hands trembling the first time she reached beneath the hens. She swept the dust from the wooden floorboards, humming softly to Samuel while he gurgled from his basket. When she tried to cook, Daniel stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching her with that same quiet gaze. She burned the bread, and he ate it anyway without a word. That silence should have been unbearable, but it wasn't. It was steady, like the ground beneath her feet, and for the first time in months, she felt safe enough to breathe. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in shades of fire and gold, Clara gathered her courage. Samuel slept in her arms, his soft curls brushing against her chin. Daniel was sitting on the porch, mending tack with slow, careful hands. She stood in the doorway, her heart racing, and finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her since that first day. "Why are you helping us?" Her voice cracked, fragile as glass. Daniel didn't look up. His hands worked the leather strap, threading it with deliberate care. His jaw flexed as though he were chewing over the words before releasing them. "Because once, someone helped me when I didn't deserve it, and I never forgot." Clara waited for more, but he said nothing else. She stepped back, uncertain whether to be relieved or unsettled. That night, she lay awake beside Samuel, turning the words over in her mind until sleep finally claimed her. The whispers started soon after. Clara first heard them when she went to the well on the edge of the ranch. Two women from town stood nearby, their voices sharp as the wind that cut through thin coats. "He's taken in strays now," one muttered. "Can't feed the whole prairie. Times are hard." The other woman's laugh was bitter. "A woman with a baby, no husband. She'll bleed him dry." Clara lowered her head, drawing Samuel closer, her cheeks burning with shame. She hurried back to the ranch, her heart heavy, the women's words echoing in her ears. When she told Daniel, expecting anger or dismissal, he only looked at her, his gaze steady. Later that evening, when a neighbor rode up and sneered at Clara from the porch, Daniel's response was calm but firm. "I'm not saving everyone, just the ones God put on my doorstep." His words struck her like a stone in water, sending ripples through the fear that had settled inside her. No one had claimed her like that before. No one had ever stood between her and the world's cruelty with such quiet strength. But peace was fragile. Samuel fell ill one night, his tiny body burning with fever. His cries grew hoarse, his skin hot under Clara's trembling hands. She rocked him, wept over him, prayed aloud, her voice shaking with panic. "I can't lose him. I can't, not after everything. Please, God, don't take him." Her tears soaked his blanket as she pressed her lips to his damp forehead. Daniel stepped into the room, saw the terror in her eyes, and didn't hesitate. He saddled his horse in the dead of night, the leather creaking, hooves pounding into the dark. Clara watched from the window, clutching Samuel, her heart in her throat. The hours stretched like years. She sat by the fire, rocking her child, whispering lullabies that had no melody, just the raw edge of a mother's love. When Daniel returned, his face was lined with exhaustion, his clothes damp with sweat. In his hands, he carried medicine from the town 2 hours away, fetched in half the time. He gave it to her without a word, his hands steady even as his chest heaved with exhaustion. Clara administered the drops, praying they would work, praying Samuel would stay. By dawn, the fever began to break. Samuel's breaths grew softer, steadier, his tiny hand curling around Clara's finger. Relief crashed over her like a flood, and she sobbed into his hair, whispering thanks again and again. She turned her tear-streaked face to Daniel, who sat slumped in the corner, too tired to stand but unwilling to leave. Her voice trembled. "You didn't just take both of us. You saved us." For the first time since she had arrived, she saw Daniel smile. It was faint, small, but it was real, and it lit his face like the sun breaking through clouds. "Maybe you saved me, too," he murmured, his voice rough but tender. Life shifted after that. Clara no longer hesitated to share the work. She rose before dawn to bake bread, her hands steady now where they had once trembled. She tended to the animals with Samuel strapped to her back, his laughter ringing out across the yard. Daniel built him a small wooden horse, rough but sturdy, and Clara caught him smiling quietly as Samuel clutched it in his tiny fists. The silence between them grew warmer, filled with unspoken understanding. Each gesture, each shared chore, each look across the table stitched their lives together like patches on a quilt. The whispers in town continued for a time, but Clara no longer flinched. Daniel's words echoed inside her whenever doubt tried to creep back. She was not a burden. She was not a stray. She was simply a woman who had been given a chance to stand again, and she had chosen to stay. As the months passed and the drought eased, the ranch became more than shelter. It became home. By winter, the air smelled of wood smoke and stew simmering on the stove. Snow dusted the fences, and Samuel's giggles filled the rooms as Daniel carried him on his shoulders. Clara watched them, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't believed she would ever feel again. She had begged for bread on a lonely road, but she had been given something far greater. In the silence of a rancher who said nothing, she had found mercy, love, and the beginning of a family.